Good morning and welcome to day two of Davos 2026. This is the Leaders and Founders Forum. We have had one day of amazing programming. We've heard from some of the best thought leaders around the world, and we continue to take forward this journey this morning by bringing back to the program Kumi Naidoo. Kumi is an amazing speaker and is currently leading the Fossil Fuels Treaty. And with that, I'm going to have Kumi and the party join. I'll be happy to introduce the panel, and then they will take over. So as we wait for them, we will also continue programming tomorrow. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Annika Pampel and Bastian Den Braber to introduce our esteemed guest and take it from here. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Kumi. Thank you again for joining us this morning. We love having you back with us. You've done a couple of panels with us and have always been a very inspirational speaker. I'm just going to let you introduce yourself because you can do it better than we ever will.
I'm currently the president. Thank you, Annika. I'm currently the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative that is seeking to address 86% of what drives climate change, which is our addiction to fossil fuels. And secondly, I also am part of the leadership of a global initiative to address the communications deficit in activism, and that's called the Global Artivism Movement. I also am a director of a foundation we set up in the name of our son when he passed 4 years ago, called the Ricky Rick Foundation for the Promotion of Artivism.
Beautiful. Let's start with the Fossil Fuel Treaty. The Fossil Fuel Treaty, as you said yourself, has drawn inspirations from agreements like the nuclear weapons ban. What made you believe that similar moral and political framework could work for fossil fuels, and what resistance has surprised you the most?
Well, firstly, it's important to just recognize that the science has been telling us since 1992 and even earlier, but let's say when the first COP was held, that fossil fuels is driving climate change. It became more and more clearer over time. But imagine it took 28 years before the term fossil fuels was even mentioned in a COP outcome document, right, from the UNFCCC process. And, that's as bizarre as Alcoholics Anonymous holding 28 years of conferences before they can get a backbone to mention the word alcohol in the outcome document. And part of it is as bizarre as Alcoholics Anonymous holding a global conference every year with 50,000 people plus or minus, depending on the year. And the largest delegation to that conference is the alcohol industry, right? And right now, even in Belém, where I just was, for every 15 delegates from government and civil society, there was one fossil fuel lobbyist. Imagine that, right? And then why we need a fossil fuel treaty is because we have been behaving in a somewhat crazy way. And to put it very simply, just imagine both of you, right? Woke up late one morning, rushed to work in a hurry, come back at the end of the day, open the door to your place, and you see, whoa, there's water coming out of the bathroom. As you rush to the bathroom, you pick up a mop in the kitchen, you open the door and you figure, oh, in my rush in the morning, I left the stopper on, right? And the tap was leaking, so it filled up, and now the water is coming into the passageway. What do you do first?
Turn off the water.
You turn off the water. You don't start mopping. What we have been doing since 1992 is mopping the floor without turning off the tap on fossil fuels. So all these efforts to get treaties, when they start off, people dismiss it and so on. But as I speak to you, we've just come out of Belém, where President Lula, in his opening comments, said the world urgently needs a fossil fuel phase-out plan. And then the fossil fuel lobbying interests, backed by certain governments, blocked again any mention of the term fossil fuels in the outcome document. That ironically turned out to be a good thing. Okay? Why? Because had it been mentioned, it would have been mentioned in a very weak way and timid way, as it was 2 years ago, which was the only one time that it was mentioned. But the fact that it was not mentioned at all put a huge burden on the Brazilian presidency of the COP to, in the closing plenary, say that we now need to support and endorse the efforts of Colombia and the conference that the Colombian government, together with the Pacific Island states and Netherlands, is hosting at the end of April, which is the first international conference for the just transition away from fossil fuels. We were organizing that. That was going to happen anyway, in partnership with with those governments, right? But now, one of the challenges, Annika, you asked who were the blockers. One of the blockers are people who think, oh, by doing this, you are going to undermine the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. Now, the UNFCCC officially has said we need a process, and that process continues in April. So I don't want to overstate it being such great news because we are not where we need to be. We are decades behind by not listening to the science, but at least we have a pathway of positivity and progress that we can embark on from April onwards.
That's actually lovely. I have a follow-up question with that because a lot of people think when it comes to fossil fuels about the transition and a just transition. What would a just transition actually look like, especially for the communities, for people that are economically tied to this for generations, where the entire family works in this field? What does that look like?
So, firstly, we must be very clear that renewable energies, solar and wind in particular, have now become extremely cheaper than coal, not only in terms of the cost or oil and gas, but also in terms of health impacts and all of that. We know that the true cost of coal must be looked at also in terms of what it costs the health system and so on. And so a just transition must make sure, of course, that workers who work in the industry are retrained in the technology sector. Secondly, we need to recognize that it's not only about workers. The just transition cannot only be about workers who are employed in the fossil fuel industry. Because what about the woman who sits outside and sells vegetables? What about the local mechanic who fixes the cars of the coal miners? If all of that shuts down, we have to have a plan of how we transition, from this. And just to be clear, with political will, these transitions can happen. When Enel, one of the largest energy companies in the world from Italy, decided in 2015 that they were going to phase out all fossil fuel and nuclear from their program,
Mhm.
they looked at the coal plants that they had and they said, let's do competitions about what people want to do with it. Some were going to be turned into museums, some into shopping centers, some into, you know, uh, facilities and so on. And to their credit, they didn't sell it to some other fossil fuel company. They knew they needed to shut it down. So there's a denial, I think, in the business community,
Mhm.
and you'll see this in Davos this year, about talking about issues as if we are not on the cliff already. Climate impacts are happening on a massive scale already. And the science uses three words: catastrophic, irreversible, runaway. Okay, thankfully, we're not already at runaway, we're not already at irreversible, but we are well into the first phases of catastrophe if you look at the number of lives that are being lost and so on. So just transition has to take care of communities um, and workers, but it has to be fast, fair, and funded. And it's up, and the time is right. And by the way, we're not asking for charity from the global north,
Right.
right? We are saying pay your climate debt. You built your economies on massive fossil fuel extraction, for which we are paying a disproportionate price right now. So if you have any sense of ethics and a sense of justice, then stomp up the money, because failure to put this money on the table will be much more costly, yeah, later on.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd love to ask a question on that when we zoom in into the mother continent, Kumi. And by the way, thank you for wearing the animal pride on your clothing. That's really dear to my heart, and it's been more than 25 years exploring that. And one of the things we see, the mother continent has, I think, 1.4 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa right now. It's going to grow to 2 billion people. You take any sector, and the largest GDP growth for the next couple of decades is expected to be in Africa. One of the things that we've seen is that, for instance, China is renewing its energy production, but it's selling off its old coal plants into countries in Africa. Some voices say, well, every industrialized country today has started off with cheap electricity from coal plantations. So every country has the right to do the same thing, basically cheap electricity to get off the ground. At the same time, there's an enormous opportunity to leapfrog straight into green energy, which obviously requires a lot of capital intense production, right? Building those capabilities. What is your perspective on, and I know we're talking 54 countries in total, but what's your perspective on the continent being able to go straight into green energy, or at least less polluting energy to fuel its growth?
I think the potential is immense, right? The science is clear. This is what we need to do. The economics is becoming increasingly more clear that this makes more sense to do. Why would we spend more on polluting coal plants when we can now actually get solar facilities done more cheaper? But importantly, if you look at Africa as a continent and you look at the fact that tens of millions of our people are living in absolute energy poverty. They don't have access to a single light bulb. Now, we have to break from conventional thinking. If you look at Africa, there are thousands of small population sized villages. Why would we want to do the stupid thing of saying we need to reach all these people through a centralized grid? It would be much cheaper, much more efficient, much faster, and we could take hundreds of millions of people out of energy poverty very fast if we seriously invested in decentralized micro solar grids, right? It's a no-brainer, really, right? But why do we not do it? The reason we don't do it, and I'm going to say this and it will upset a lot of people, so be it, but the supply chain of corruption is much more bigger, much more juicier, much more political influence garnering, right? When you do big mega projects, whether it's fossil fuels or otherwise, and a lot of the big extractive projects have been in fossil fuels. If you do solar, you're not going to have the centralized power and influence that you have as a company to hold a government often to account because you are providing electricity to that government. So I think we must recognize that climate change and our failure to act to it is a failure of our economic system, our political system, and belies the fact that we have today a system that respects multilateralism and international law. When we look at the invasion of Venezuela, which at least this president of the United States, I want to give him one credit, at least he does not lie about it. He says, I'm there for the oil. Yeah, you can start lying first about, cocaine, none of which comes from Venezuela, about fentanyl, none of which comes from Venezuela. And when he sees he can't lie any further, the truth comes out. Very clearly, it's about oil. So the last thing I would say is humanity needs to get itself off fossil fuels for another very important reason, which Venezuela brings to the fore. And that is the fact that our world has been wrecked by conflict and extractivism and racism and colonialism and injustice because of fossil fuels. If we reduce our dependency, have a more decentralized energy system, and so on, that will give us, listen, it's not going to be easy. And none of us, by the way, are suggesting that we can switch off the fossil fuels tomorrow, right? Because it's so baked in our system. What we are saying is we can't go year in, year out to the UNFCCC COP process asking for a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. And each year, what we get is a flab deal, FLAB, full of loopholes and BS, right? We cannot continue ignoring what Albert Einstein said when he said a definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. So to my leaders on the African continent who might listen to this, I would say to you, yes, you've been put into a difficult situation. COVID's left us with a lot of debt. And the temptation when you're finding fossil fuel reserves right now to dive into it, be careful. Firstly, that's going to harm us because we are taking more climate impacts. But secondly, once the global north and the people that you think you're going to be exporting to wake up and say, hey, the climate crisis is far too serious, it's hitting us now, you're going to end up with stranded carbon assets, and it's going to be a colossal negative economic reality to deal with.
I have a follow-up question as we're getting a little bit into politics. I'm going to keep it light, don't worry, but you've lightly hinted at lobbyism. There's growing skepticism about whether global forums like Davos can actually meaningfully address structural injustices rather than simply discuss it. What accountability do spaces like this owe to people most affected by the decisions made there?
Wow. Okay, so you asked me. No, I love the question. I attended more than close to 20 Davoses myself. And I can tell you that what I found very frustrating was people walk around Davos as if they own the world.
Yep.
And they do, right?
I know.
And they do, right? And you know, if people pretend they have power and perform and they don't have it, you can ignore them, right? So as the Secretary General of Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation, as the head of Greenpeace and the head of Amnesty, I was obligated to go. And we used those four. And what was my main reaction of it? Of course, there are lots of good people that they attend, from civil society, from progressive parts of business, and so on. But largely, it's a gathering to do deals, right?
Yep.
To do business. And I don't think the World Economic Forum sets itself up as wanting to make big structural and systemic changes, as your question suggested, Annika. You know, listen, I was in Davos during the Asian financial crisis, or shortly thereafter, after the global financial crisis, and during and after COVID. And all of this taught us, all those global crises, it was as if the universe was saying to us, guys, no more incremental tinkering while it's not that the planet is at risk. The planet actually does not need saving. The planet is absolutely fine. If we continue on the suicidal path that we're on, we warm up our planet to a point where we can't grow food, we destroy our soil, water resources. End result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And to all my friends listening who are concerned about saving the planet, the good news is once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So we have to understand what's at stake here is securing our children and their children's future. And so when all of these crises happen, what is the response of power? When all of these crises that I mentioned, the global financial crisis, COVID, and so on, exposes the fact that we don't have systems that serve anywhere close to the majority of people on the planet, right? What is our response? It's all about system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. But what is urgently needed right now is system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign. So I would humbly say to those that are gathered at Davos. You are engaged in a massive case of cognitive dissonance and denial if you do not realize that it cannot be business as usual. You cannot prop up a system that has alienated and marginalized a vast majority of humanity. You cannot have a system that creates so much of insecurity and risk. And thankfully, the answers are there, the solutions are there, and political will is what needs to be mustered. And thankfully, political will is a renewable resource. And hopefully, some of these leaders who are pushing authoritarianism, fascism, climate denialism, and so on will soon discover that at the ballot boxes if they allow such elections to proceed.
Do you have hope that some of those leaders that are currently in denial might be able to change their mind and do the right thing?
You see, that is a good question. That question presumes that the leaders in question, right, have read the science which their scientists have told them, right? Read it and said, oh, this is bullshit. This doesn't make sense. We're not going to do that. No, let me tell you, the Republican administration, Saudi Arabia, Russia, I've sat across the table in the Kremlin across Vladimir Putin in 2006, where I chaired a meeting of civil society, and there is absolutely no way that anybody could suggest that Putin doesn't understand the climate science. It was a 3-hour meeting just before the G8 then in St. Petersburg, but this was in Moscow a couple of months earlier. And all these leaders who were denying that. So it's not about, I want to make a distinction in the question. It's not about they genuinely need to be convinced that it's a problem. They
Right.
have arrived at a position where they just don't care. They've got, it's either whether people have myopic dreams about, well, at least two of the leaders have myopic dreams about extending their territory, right? One is
Right.
engaged in it already, right? So the changing, and I have absolute, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was a hero and mentored many of us, right? He used to say, I am a prisoner of hope, right? And right now, the way I put it is this: in the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism, our thought, our creativity, our actions, and our sense of humanity. So, do I have hope that governments can change? Yes. When the fossil fuels treaty started 4 years ago, everybody said you wouldn't get a single government to endorse it and say we need a treaty. As I talk to you, we are about to exceed 20 countries, including 3 fossil fuel exporting countries: Timor-Leste, or East Timor, as some people know them as a previous name, Pakistan, and Colombia, right? These are 3 fossil fuel exporting countries who say, even though our economy is dependent at the moment on fossil fuel income, we know that it's wrong for our country, we know it's wrong for humanity, and we need to agree a treaty where we all agree, are we going to phase out from this poison that's killing our children's futures as fast as possible? So yes, I have qualified hope. I am not suggesting the road ahead is going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be exceptionally difficult, but there is enough people, especially young people, who have got it clear in their heads that if they don't push our leaders to change now, they are going to be paying the worst brunt of impacts of climate change, and their futures are at stake. And I think young people today understand how to shift audiences in much more powerful ways than people of my generation are. And I hope that they don't. Young people now, I would say, must not embrace the logic of young people are the leaders of tomorrow. If you wait for tomorrow, there might not be a tomorrow for you to take leadership. So to young people right now, bring your fresh lenses of perspective into old intractable problems and push our economic system, our political system, our social systems, and so on to deliver much more than they're currently delivering.
Yeah.
We wanted to talk. Sorry, go ahead, Bastian.
Yeah, quick question. So earlier we spoke about like the immense growth that is happening in the African continent specifically, and there's a huge energy investment boom that is pending. There's also something else that's happening kind of behind the scenes at the moment, which is food scarcity. China owning a huge percentage of the pork production in the US. Middle Eastern countries owning protein production in the United States because they don't have the lands themselves. And this is all shifting, and there's even private equity money from the United States buying up farmland in Africa. And that's another sector, and there's probably many others, where there's an innate opportunity to own the production for its own people and for the world as an export product. I think the big question that maybe underlies most of those sectors and different opportunities is, how do we get investment money to come into Africa and actually seize the opportunity, which is probably not a problem of the upside, it's probably more a challenge on the risk side. Would you agree? And how do you see that?
Um, yeah, firstly, I mean, investment is flowing into Africa on an unprecedented scale at the moment, right? Uh, the question is, what is the quality of that investment, right?
Mm.
Is that investment going to continue to be extractive as it's historically been, right? Western colonialism, right? What we like to say in Africa is that, when Tony Blair used to say, Africa is a scar on the conscience of humanity, we used to think, no, Europe is a scar on the conscience of humanity. You all gave us fossil fuel dependency, slavery, military industrial complex, colonialism, and so on. But what we like to say is Africa is the richest continent underneath the ground. And that's precisely why we're one of the poorest continents above the ground, what the academic literature calls the resource curse. So right now, we don't want to just say investment at all costs, right? So like if China's investment here is really improving infrastructure and so on. However, we need our governments to say to China, okay, we need local people trained to do that. We need to make sure that, whatever that resource is, not everything gets extracted, right? I mean, on agriculture, for me, I am most concerned first and foremost that the African people need to have good, nutritious food and not starve and not suffer from the health. And then you think about food as export. Problem is, many countries have been put in a situation while our own people are starving, right? We are having to send food. And also from a climate change perspective, we need to reduce the distance that food travels to get to a table, right? You know, uh, So, so the investment possibilities are there. What I would say is that I would appeal now to the leadership on the African continent. Far too often, the resources underneath the ground and the resources above the ground goes to the elites on our continent.
Mhm.
We cannot, as a strong anti-colonial voice for decades, I say to the leaders of the African continent, there are some things we can blame on colonial history, and there's some things we cannot. You cannot blame on colonial history that you took a big grant and gave half the money to your family. You
Right.
can't, say that we can cancel elections and change constitutions just because we suddenly believe somebody is so great and competent, right? So, having said all of that, I think that Africa's century is this century could be Africa's century if we are correct, right? Where we can see some significant improvements, and we need to just make sure that we put ordinary people's interests first and not the interests of the elites, as many countries that call themselves democracy do blatantly every single day.
Right.
One last question for you, Kumi, as we're starting to run out of time to wrap this up. We wanted to talk a little bit about artivism. And we live in a society where we second screen movies, where our next generation below us doesn't watch anything without their phone in their hands, without 14 other distractions. How do you see artivism becoming or being truly important in changing our outlook? How do you focus minds again to see art as a partial piece of change and politics?
So, firstly, we need to acknowledge that historically, arts and the power of culture more generally has played a massive role in the course of history.
Mhm.
Fascists, authoritarians, totalitarians, democracy-seeking people have all used it. In fact, one of the geniuses of Steve Bannon, one of President Trump's key ideologues, is that he understands and understood for a long time that culture drives politics, politics does not drive culture, right? And they were able to, like in the 2016 election, use fake Facebook micro-targeting to reach various very specific cultural subsets in a way that even if that voter didn't agree on 80%, but that one thing that that voter felt passionate about, for example, I hate LGBTIQ people, if they would, and that was weaponized, then even if it wasn't in the economic interests and so on, that happened. So part of the problem today is that most activists, including myself, must acknowledge that we spoke in ways that was too policy wonkish, too jargonistic, and as uh, we lead this work through a foundation we set up in the name of our son called the Rikirik Foundation for the Promotion of Artivism. And in the last conversation with him, he said, you guys don't aim everything here and ignore the heart, the body, and the soul. Most ordinary people are not moved, whether in the United States or whether, in some country in Africa. People are not moved by thick policy papers, dense speeches, and so on. They're moved by music, by dance, by theater, by food, by fashion,
Right.
and so on. And we need to harness that power. So I'll just say, harnessing the power of arts and culture alone will not deliver our salvation from the climate crisis and the intersecting crises. However, failing to harness the power of arts and culture almost guarantees that we fail. If anybody's interested in knowing more about this, please go to globalartivism.org, and to artists and cultural creatives and anybody interested in amplifying the power of arts and culture, please feel free to join this movement. Similarly, for those who are keen to get more involved in the fossil fuel treaty advocacy, you can join as a supporter as an individual or through your organization on fossilfueltreaty.org. As you can see, I'm old, but I still have to learn all these things of marketing and getting the sound bites in. And I hope my colleagues see that they'll say, oh, yes, he ticked off the website box at least. I probably didn't tick off many other boxes, but at least I hope I ticked off the website box.
No, the plugs were perfect. Thank you, Kumi. Thank you so much for this fireside chat. We both appreciate it. Bastian, you want to lead us out?
Well, I'm just really impressed by not just your experience in with the work you've done with all these organizations, but also the way you keep standing at the forefront and repeating the message that needs to be put out there. And the world depends on voices like yourself. So just a big thank you for being that man and how you show up for the world, really.
Thank you. That's very kind. Good luck with all your efforts. And I hope people listening to this take away one message, and that is we all have a simple choice. We're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. And choosing to be neutral and not to engage, sadly, in this moment of history, is making a choice to be part of the problem. So our children and their children's futures at stake, please do everything you can to understand how bad the climate crisis already is and to understand the wonderful solutions that are there that can address climate at the same time as giving us a more equitable and just economy. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Kumi.
Thank you, Kumi. Thank you, Annika. Thank you, Bastian. Kumi, always a pleasure to have you here. We are grateful and that you are still fighting the fight, which started decades ago and continues. For people like you, I think you are an inspiration to all of us, and we will continue to watch and see. And any help we can do is obviously there, and any amplification we can do is obviously yours. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.